in support of people and the planet. And like today, she gives talks and runs workshops and teaches on localization, and is an active in the international collaborations for new economy. Anja is joining us today from what sounds idyllic, an eco-village in Mexico. So it's lunchtime for her. So good afternoon to you and good evening to everyone else. So I will hand over to Anja for her talk.
Hi there. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And I wish I could be with you in person so I could see everybody face to face, which is much nicer, but we'll have to do this way. And anyway, as Joey was saying, I'm tuning in from a cloud forest in Mexico in a small eco-village. You can probably gather that I'm not Mexican, I'm actually Danish, but I happen to live here. And I work for Local Futures, an international NGO, which is a kind of pioneer in the localization movement. Well, today I'm talking about localization from an international big picture perspective. And so just a little bit about what I'll be talking about. I'll be addressing the shift from global to local, and I'll say something about why we need to do that, even though I'm sure we all have some idea about that. I'll talk about localization in action and bring up specific case studies that I find particularly inspiring. I'll also talk about the emerging global movement for localization, which can seem like an oxymoron, but actually it makes a lot of sense. And then I'll also just highlight a few resources that you might find useful. I'll be showing shortly a bit of a PowerPoint presentation with more images than text, so hopefully that will make it a little bit more lively than just watching me. But often what I do if we were together, I would have done some more interactive exercises. I would, for example, set the scene with a few sort of questions, a little game, kind of multiple choice. For example, I would say, bring up some of the classic examples from our present day dominant global economy. For example, how far does cod fished off the coast of Scotland travel before it reaches Scottish plates? And I'd say, 100 miles, 1,000 miles, 10,000 miles. And the right answer is 10,000 miles, because it travels all the way to China to get deboned before it comes back again and ends up in the freezer in Scottish supermarkets. Scotland is not unique in this. This is very common, and it only makes sense because we have a very mad economy where we subsidize fossil fuels, where we give all sorts of hidden subsidies that can make food from far away far cheaper than food, produced around the quarter, with the farmer 40 miles away. Another example, is bottled imported something has become a very popular luxury item in China. What is it? Beer, water, air, tea. Any guesses? Put them in the chat box. The right answer is oxygen. Oxygen that is bottled in Canada's pristine forests are sold on the market in China because a lot of Chinese live in big cities with a lot of air pollution. Why do they live in big cities with a lot of air pollution? Because most of the world has moved all their dirty industries to China, and can then claim often that they have cleaned up their environment or are doing good on their CO2 emissions, but all the big dirty industries, the things that we consume, are often produced in China, which makes them a good market for bottled oxygen. Another example of this mad economy is Iceland importing. What do they import in very large quantities, do you think? From Norway, the UK, from the US? Is it cheese? Is it ice cubes? Is it rocks? It's ice cubes, because they're cheaper, because they come in, again, subsidized from abroad. No? So those are just some examples that show you that we don't have a logical economy. And of course, this is about equity, and I'm sure you all are familiar with the data from Oxfam that are really good at researching, wealth distribution. And the last data I saw from them was in 2017, where they had calculated that the 8 wealthiest individuals own the same wealth as half of this planet's humanity. The poorest half. No? So obviously it's not an equitable economy. So we have this economy of growth, a global economy that is very, it's a corporate control economy, really. And that is based around perpetual growth, which I'm sure is one of the reasons why you at the University of York are looking at other alternatives now. But it is an economy out of control, and the few examples I just gave you are not exceptions by any means. It's more the rule than the exception. And anything that grows perpetually is dangerous. We know that from our own bodies. The only thing that really continues growth is cancer. And this is the kind of economy we have applied on a very large scale. And of course, there's growth, which means that you have to make more money. All the companies have to make more money. Just making the same mix is not enough. It's continuous growth requires continuous consumption. So we, citizens of planet Earth, are groomed to consume from cradle to grave. And for example, the latest figures show that on average, people are exposed to between 6,000 and 10,000 ads a day and brand marketing. I mean, this is, even back in 2013, where, we didn't use mobile phones so much, it was something like 4,000 to 5,000. But now with the digital mediums at our fingertips, we get exposed to much more. And of course, it's the part of the package. Grow and consume. No, and I don't need, I think, to tell you about the destructiveness of this economy, because we all hear about it all the time, and a lot of us feel very anxious about whether we'll survive, whether the planet survive, will the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and many more. No? So at Local Futures and others have for quite a long time thought that the most sensible thing we can do is to shift direction. I mean, we have been spending many, many years, many of us, very concerned individuals trying to make positive changes. But we have, I would say, overall, perhaps been sidetracked by single issues and not a systemic thinking, which has delayed the positive result despite the efforts of so many, well-intentioned people. So we've been focused on social, on climate, on soils, but we haven't been very good at working together. And we have often ended up supporting sort of downstream solutions. For example, take the waste of plastic. How many decades haven't we talked about waste, And then it was, be a good citizen and make sure to put it in the bin. Then it was, let's separate and recycle. Then it was, let's ban single-use plastic. But what if we had said from the beginning, looked at it from a big picture perspective, let's remove the subsidies to fossil fuels. Had we done that, we wouldn't have had the problems with plastic and microplastic everywhere. So these are the kinds that we need to look at things at a different lens, and we need to push for a systemic shift, we think, from global to local. I wonder, Rian, if you could oh yeah, I am actually, you did allow me to screen share. So I'm going to shift in now to, can you see my screen? Oh, I see, nobody can answer me. Actually, just let me start from the beginning.
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. So what I said, we need to shift direction, and that by that I'm referring to politically and economically. We need to shift power away from global corporate businesses to governments and regional and local economies. Let me see if sorry, I'm having trouble here. Right. Control of my buttons, which means away from what has, the de facto global government of interlinked banks and corporations that effectively are squeezing people and the planet and making us charade of our democracies. And part of this is facing what I call a free trade dogma. We are all the time as part of this growth package. Free trade, so-called free trade, is taking precedence over the well-being of people, over the well-being of the planet. Free trade, the right to, shift goods and set up business wherever you are, if you are big enough, is seen as more important because it's seen as essential to growth and more important than, for example, tackling the climate crisis. And part of it is the ISDS, which is a really dangerous thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that, with the investor state dispute settlements that allow corporations to sue governments if they do anything that can affect the foregone revenue of a business. I'll be getting into localization just in a minute, but I think this is very important. For example, here are some examples of a snapshot of some of the demands that are going on around the world. Often it's energy companies. For example, here 2 energy companies suing the Netherlands because they want to phase out coal power station. British Oil suing Italy because they want to ban offshore drilling. In Tanzania, there's a company that is suing the Tanzanian government because they want to stop corporate land grabbing, and so forth. This is happening in corporate courts, away from the public eye, in secrecy, and even when the governments do win, the cost of these lawsuits are so big that essentially they lose. And that affects policy making because often governments, particularly more poorer countries, for example, in the global south, don't dare to make the right legislative decisions in case they have to end up paying billions and billions of dollars. And another thing is what I mentioned before. I was alluding to the subsidies, the corporate welfare that we are handing over and facilitating this destructive economy, the fossil fuel subsidies that have been going on for years, the subsidies to global infrastructure, to industrial agriculture. I don't know if you're aware that we're handing out on a global scale $1 million per minute to industrial agriculture. Only 1% goes to regenerative organic farming. So we are supporting the wrong thing. And what we need to do is to change the policies that shape the economy. That means the regulations, the subsidies, even the taxes in support of place-based businesses and economies that operate within ecological limits in service of people, not big corporations. And that, in particular, I want to highlight, we need to look at the over-regulation and the unfair taxation of the small and the local, and the opposite, which is the deregulation and the subsidies of the big and the global. small, local, or even medium-sized businesses or manufacturers don't have a chance if they have to pay a lot of taxes and the big companies don't, and if they are over-regulated while the big international corporations aren't. So this is very important in order to have a systemic shift towards localization that we refer to as a bit of a solution multiplier, because by localizing, it's much easier for us to be accountable for our actions, to see what needs to be done, to look after our environment, our people, and to have a smaller carbon footprint, an ecological footprint. And by that is very important, then we need to think about redesigning around the principles of localization with equity and well-being in mind. Building community and having a closer relationship to other people and also to nature. And it's important, people often ask me, you know, what is local? How do we define local? It depends, but I think we should be guided by a subsidiarity principle, which says that you should have the decision making at the nearest or lowest level possible. And with production, for example, you know, vegetable production might come very close by, might be the radius of 50 miles. If you production for grains, it might need to be 100 miles or 150 miles, oils and textiles further, industrial goods, maybe even further. But the guiding principle should be to produce for local needs, basic needs first, and when you have a surplus, then, you know, sell on a national level, sell on an international level, not the other way around, where we are depending for our very basic needs from goods and services that come, you know, often from very long distances. And the cod example I gave earlier. The same with the decision making, you know, locally and regionally, nationally, we need to be in charge of the fundamental things that affect us. Whereas, you know, there are certain things that make sense to do on an international level. For example, instead of having a World Trade Organization, we should have a World Environment Organization. Part of the localization movement, or a central part, has been the local food movement. And I used to work in the UK actually with the local food movement when it just started. And I think the UK is a brilliant example. I think you are further ahead than many others. But a local food movement that looks at food sovereignty and security, regenerative farming, community-supported agriculture, human-scale production, independent shops that can have local produce, local markets, local food on the menu. It's hugely important, and we consider the local food one of the first aspects that one should consider and should focus on when we want to strengthen our local economies and communities. Farmers markets, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a brilliant place to buy directly from farmers. It's also a place that helps to generate more wealth within local economies, 10 times more than if you buy in a supermarket, because the money circulates instead of leaking out of local economies. Your people also have more conversations, more interaction. It's a brilliant place to build community. I had the pleasure of interviewing someone that started farmers market in Costa Rica, Feria Verde, and learned the huge impact that such a market can have, going from no local produce on sale in the capital to 2 weekly markets with 3,000 consumers per week. That helped 500 families maintain their livelihoods from the market, and built a lot of awareness in the process. Another example is the Copenhagen Food Co-op, which in Danish is called Københavns Fødevarefællesskab. It's based around the principles of the Saikatsu in Japan, which is not a cooperative in its classical sense, but you know, a buying cooperative that buys directly from local farmers in season produce, and then they have like a bit like a box scheme or a bag, a weekly bag, and they've got 3,000 members in Copenhagen with, I think it's 9 different sort of departments that cater for different neighborhoods. And it's been a model that has been copied by 21 other co-ops in Denmark. So it's a great way for people, particularly in cities, to make direct link with local farmers and have healthy food in season. We work together with the Zimbabwean Smallholder Organic Farmers Forum, which is another example that are very focused on food sovereignty, producing organic, and for local consumption. And they have, I encourage you to read article they wrote, one of them wrote in The Guardian actually, about small farmers feeding the world. And so there are lots of these initiatives going on a worldwide scale. This is just a little snippet. Another important thing in the localization movement are the local business alliances, and perhaps the best known is BALE, which is a local business alliance for business alliance for local living economies, where local businesses basically band together to have buy local campaigns, but also to educate local governments on the importance of having local independent businesses. For the well-being of communities, they are the ones that pay taxes, for example. Quite often the big companies have their own deals and hardly pay any taxes. And they are the ones that also carry local produce, they're offering local services, and they are strengthening the local economy and the well-being. So that's very important. I love the British totally locally campaign materials that have helped many communities around the world to bring focus on how to strengthen their local economy. It's well worth checking out. There are also many local finance and investment initiatives going on around the world, ethical banks and credit unions. There's a global alliance, I think it's called Global Alliance for Banking on Values, that I would recommend that you look at, where you have banks from all over and credit unions from all over the world, where profit isn't their only motive and isn't necessarily their first motive either, where there is investment in ethical businesses, in ecological businesses. There are equities trusts, there are many local finance groups geared towards investment at a local level in sustainable businesses or initiatives, or equity trusts that hold land for community benefits to protect, for example, their forests, their waterways, and so forth. Oh, and the Re-economy initiative in Totnes in Devon is also really worth taking a look at. I want to mention a cooperative in Portugal. Yesterday, I was interviewing 2 founding members of this integral cooperative. It's a model I have never come across. It's integral in the sense that it has does many different things at the same time. But their central thing is that it is like an umbrella for many small local and even micro businesses. So they have this cooperative have an accountant that does the accounting, the taxes, the invoices for. I think they have 75 different business members. Some of them do have produce, others provide services. It varies from food production to biocosmetic, textiles, graphic designers, what have you. And they also have a shop where they sell local produce. The shop is run independently and makes a profit. And the cooperative is funded by a 5% fee of everything that is sold through the cooperative. They also have things like looking at affordable housing to help people with affordable housing. And they have a focus on promoting agri-ecological practices, degrowth, and diminished consumption. So many different things. I think it's a model that could be really promising for many other places in the world. I've spoken quite a lot about food because that's what I know most about, and also because food is central, but of course to our well-being and our survival. But it's not the only thing. And for example, a lot of things that have been happening lately in the with fibers and people seeking to produce sustainable fibers, but also regional fiber networks. And one that I want to point out is called Fiber Shed, and it's found in California, the US. It's really worth having a look at. And they hold every year like a symposium, and I took part this year. And they have links with people around the world, also links with people that are at the receiving end of the fast fashion industry and our consumption of that, of fast fashion, people in parts of Africa that ends up with all the garbage. And so they're looking at many things at once, but above all, their focus is on localizing fibers and textiles, and they work with farmers, they work with textile producers, with dyers, with the whole chain. Well worth a look. And of course, there are also many other creative community spaces like the repair cafes that are looking at building community, but at waste, at not creating waste, diminishing consumption, and they're looking at repairing rather than buying new things. And also tool libraries that are often part of that, where people can share their resources, so we don't all need to have a sewing machine or a drill or what have you. Really good ideas. Actually, the repair cafes in particular have been very good at creating intergenerational community, which is often quite difficult, in particular in the Western world, where we often live separate, not like here in Mexico where I live, where people live with many generations. But the repair cafes have been a particularly good place for this intergenerational interaction. And I think key to real localization is that we become in control of our own energy supply. So we all know that we have to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but it's not just about switching from one energy type to another. We also need to look at who owns the energy. We need to look at decentralization and wherever possible in community ownership. If we just think about changing to a so-called green economy, where we just change the energy to renewable, we will still have the same destructive economy. For example, we're still producing the same amount of stuff, we need the same mining, etc., that are putting huge pressures on the planet. So it's not just about changing to renewable energy. A brilliant example of a community renewable energy project is Feldheim in Germany, where they have only 55 turbines, but 99% of the energy is sold to nearby grids. So this is like real local production for local consumption. Oops. Another example is the Celewatt co-op in France. So it has 800 members. It has 1 hectare of solar panels for a small town. It's all funded by local investors and installed by local companies. And they even gone as far, which I think is brilliant, I hadn't seen that before, as having the whole structure built by wood, oak wood, that they have a sustainable oak production locally, which saves quite a lot of resources by building that structure out of wood. Of course, very, very important is that we legislate for the future we want. As I was talking before about the free trade and the subsidies, we need to shift that on an international scale and also on a national scale. But there are also other things that we need to do to create the economies that facilitate the future that we want and what then we need more than anything. One good example, I think, is the gross national happiness, which is in Bhutan, where they, instead of focusing on gross domestic production, GDP, they are focusing on gross national happiness, which has looking at the psychological well-being, the health, how we use time, cultural diversity, good governance, how we look after our environment, and so forth. So the focus is on well-being. Of course, in the UK, you have in Wales a very important set of legislation, the Well-being of Future Generations Act, that also focuses on the well-being, on not sacrificing the well-being of future generations for immediate needs. Of course, any legislation is only as good as, you know, as the way we implement it and the way we monitor how we are doing. So one of the criticisms I've heard of the Well-being of Future Generations Act is that there haven't been sufficient attention to the ecological footprint of Wales in the short and also longer term. But I think the intention is very good, and I think we could learn a lot from that. There are also other examples of progressive legislation. I just want to mention a few. Sikkim, which in India has legislated 100% organic in the state of Sikkim. Vanuatu, for example, had piloted a ban on imported junk food. There are quite a lot of bio districts it started in Italy, but it's spread around the world, which is also focused on bio as in organic, ecological growing. Here's an example of in town in Pennsylvania that has banned industrial livestock production. So there are many, many examples of how we can legislate for a better future. And I think one thing I want to point out is the public procurement is a really, really good tool to make changes quickly. If our local governments or regional governments, even national governments favor local and sustainable businesses, then we can make a real shift quite rapidly. Milan is a really good example of this. Excuse me. They serve 80,000 meals a day to nurseries, kindergarten, schools, retirement homes, hospitals, and in nurseries, 100% of the food is organic, 66% in other institutions, 25% is locally sourced, and 57% from short distribution chains. And whatever they import is fair traded. So I think, you know, that's an example of how to support the right businesses. And of course, the Preston model is well known around the world, for which is sort of making the public procurement work at a very sort of systemic scale. So here we have what they call anchor institutions, which could also be private businesses, but they often are public businesses, where they buy from local, independent, often worker-owned cooperatives. So then you look at both the sustainable and the equitable side of things. So that's also something that I often point to the Preston model. At Local Futures, we think, like, what do we need to do? The most important thing is to connect with others and change the I to a we, so that we're not alone. And that we often highlight that we need to resist the corporate economy and renew, as we've just seen many people do, and educate about the need for change. Those are key actions if we want to have systemic change. And as I was saying, resisting the corporate globalization, a lot of people around the world are doing just that. And unfortunately, it is needed. It's not enough just to focus on renewal when mining companies are threatening communities, fracking, oil drilling, what have you. So we need to be alert, and we need to collaborate with others to support their resistance. And but perhaps one of the most important things is, for us, big picture activism, which is about rethinking basic assumptions. What is progress? What is development? Where do we want to go? To expose the global economic system for what it is and show what's not working and where the key mechanisms are, you know, things to change, the so-called free trade treaties, the subsidies, the unfair tax systems that favor the big over the small. We need to puncture the economic growth myth and show that another way is possible, like sharing inspiring examples, because otherwise it's very difficult to imagine that things can be different. It's very easy for people to think that the economic system is somehow evolutionary and that changing it is naive. I want to point to the Planet Local Library, the Local Futures has on our website. If you want to get inspired, we've got a lot of examples, by no means all, but just a few examples of initiatives that are happening around the world in these and other areas. We also have an action guide that we that was launched last year, Localization Action Guide. It has its own website. It's got 146 actions, from joining community gardens to organizing citizen assemblies. You can find case studies and toolkits there. We are planning to add more categories later this year, but at the moment we've got 6 that is really worthwhile looking at. There are also other websites like this one, Communities for the Future, or for Future, which has some really good example, also worthwhile looking at. Oops. And I also wanted to point out that for the last couple of years, we at Local Futures have been running a day called World Localization Day. The focus of this day is, on one hand, to celebrate all the amazing initiatives that are going on around the world, but also to highlight localization as a systemic strategy for change that is relevant on a global level. And last year, we had over 80 global partners in 30 countries taking part, that were hosting face-to-face events, online events, and we will be doing something similar this year. And that is on June 21st, but there will be events going on all around in the whole month of June around the world. We also have a network called the International Alliance for Localization, with members for over 50 countries. Right now we are running a series with featuring people with hands-on localization experience. For example, we just had one about time banking, reclaiming the commons, and the cooperative from Portugal I was mentioning to you earlier. So also something, a resource to think about. And then there are many other movements that in each their way are working for systemic change. So I just thought I'd name some of the most important ones. You might not have heard of them, or you might have heard of them, but it's very important to keep them in mind. There is definitely hope, and there are a lot of people doing really good things. So despite all the crises that we are facing, I think there is really a great possibility to changing things, to have a future where that works both for people and the planet, if we manage to put a stop also to the corporate global growth economic model that we have presently. So we need to do both things, resist and renew. Thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing now.
Thank you, Anja. That was fascinating. Now, if we are recording this session, so if people want to don't want to be on the recording, but they do want to ask a question, then please put it in chat. Alternatively, if you are happy to be included in the recording and to be heard or seen, then if you could raise your hand if you've got a question using the reactions button on the bottom right hand side of the menu bar, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Well, just to give people some time to think, I was just going to ask you, Anja, have you seen, as a result of the pandemic, has it helped the shift towards localization, with people not being able to go out into their usual shops or necessarily get things from abroad because of slow delivery times and things like that? Has that helped the movement in any way, and where have you noticed the change most?
Well, it really has. I don't think it's I'm the only one to say that, but people have really had to had time to rethink and refocus. And have many people, and because we work with so many organizations all over the world, are saying the same thing, that it's quite often been the local food systems that kicked in during particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. Suddenly it became very apparent how dangerous it is to rely on these very long supply chains with I don't know how many intermediaries. That's one thing. And there's so many inspiring examples about local food initiatives, that new ones that came to life during the pandemic. The other thing that we are seeing is a huge trend of people moving from cities to the countryside. Now, there are positives and negatives to that. The positive is that people want to go out, they want to live with their, more meaningful lives, they want community, they want to have connection to the land, and they come with new energy. I mean, I'm seeing that where I'm living here, new ideas, with they're not just thinking about, I'm going to go and live an isolated nuclear life. I want to be part of something and contribute. So that's good. The bad thing is that it's pushing up land prices in many places, meaning that often local people find it more difficult to, say, buy a house or buy some land. No? So that's the negative side of it. But we started with the World Localization Day in 2019 because we couldn't do any of our face-to-face work. So we thought, let's do something online and bring attention to this. Now, we did that the first year by bringing voices together from all over the world and making a pre-recorded program with over 100 voices for, I don't know how many countries, but 6 continents. People from 174 countries tuned into that. I mean, 174 countries, there are only about 200 countries in the world. That shows that there's an interest, no? That shows that people are questioning the present economy and thinking along different lines. So definitely the pandemic has made a change.
And in terms of how we, currently we're measuring success, as you say, on GDP. What would you suggest is a better metric then for the future if we're not looking at individual companies and turnovers and dividends and share price? What sort of would be better metrics to show the effect, the true effect of companies on the environment?
Well, I mean, the metrics for I mean the GDP. Were you saying GDP?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's countrywide, but yes,
yeah. So I mean, I think the gross national happiness, which is the one I showed from Bhutan, is a very good example because they have many, many different metrics that, you know, they measure things like from, you know, are people rested? You know, do people feel rested? Do people feel they have a meaningful life? Are people healthy? Is there equity? They even measure things like forest cover, and they have a very concrete aim, which is like 50% of the country has to be under forest. You know, that's a very nitty-gritty metric. Now, but they have it's quite complicated. There's the system. There's another one called Genuine Progress Index that is also an alternative to GDP, because of course the GDP it doesn't measure anything but economic activity. Or, you know, so it could be because of war that there's a lot of economic activity because we have to. It can be because of crises. Quite often it is that can push up GDP and make it look positive. No? I think there's a question here from some Francis. Oh, I can't hear you, Joe.
Sorry, that's my mistake. So yes, for
yeah, okay.
for the sake of recording this, there's a question in the chat, which is that Francis has said he's used the idea of localization, and his doubt is whether the world having local communities able to sustain current world population with a fair standard of living. Could you explain in the context of food sufficiency in Netherlands or any Northern European country?
All right. Yes, Francis, I do understand your question. It's very clear. And there's definitely no doubt that more localized economies and also with food are less wasteful. So in that sense, a shift is better with a bigger population. But you're quite right when you point to Netherlands, which, like my own country, Denmark, is tiny and highly populated. I wouldn't know whether the Netherlands would be able to feed itself on its own soil. I know that in the 90s, I remember a report, I even have it here, where there was a study in Denmark about whether Denmark could feed itself organically. And that was like in 95, and it found that it could feed itself even in our small country. but we would need to change our diets. So it would be more plant-based. There would be particularly more plant-based, and so it was possible. So you know, small farmers are, despite the latest report from the UN, which has been criticized by movements all around the world, small farmers are the ones that presently are feeding about 70% of the world's population. When we said with their basic needs. Of course, a lot is produced on a very large scale, which is often animal feed, and it's often you know, biofuels and sugar plantations and etc. No? So, oh, you're in Finland, Francis. Okay. I don't know the situation of Finland, but I know there are some very, very good people working around these issues as well in Finland. So I think we would have a much better chance of sustaining the world population in an equitable manner if we had localized, place-based economies that would obviously be collaborating and trading with each other, where the focus would be first on meeting basic needs locally rather than producing for distant markets. Yeah.
So how does that fit then with fair trade and the sort of provision of additional external income to countries, you know, that would be beyond what they would achieve without those sort of fair trade links? Yeah.
So when we talk about localization, we're not talking about there's not going to be any international trade, but we're talking about that people shouldn't be using their best lands to be producing export crops for someone else, and then be left with, say, marginal bad soils for their own production. And fair trade, I think, has a very important role to play when it comes to producing and exporting kind of extras, so luxury goods or things, you know, that we simply cannot by any means produce, you know, at home, say coffee or chocolate or something like that. No? But like Vandana Shiva says, often points out that, you know, India cannot afford to spend more of their land or water to be producing, you know, lettuce for Western markets when they can't adequately produce for themselves. So it's the kind of changing that logic. I mean, there was a time when fair trade was seen a bit like a blanket solution. If we had just had fair trade, then everything would be all right. That was in the 90s, and we've seen that things are not all right, because trade had become almost like a, you know, economic growth and global trade. It's a dogma. It's almost like a religion. You know, there isn't much logic to it. And there aren't many benefits for ordinary people, not even for national governments. No, it's producers in different parts of the world that end up being pitted against each other in this corporate economy. I mean, I worked with, for example, British milk producers back in 2000, and I've heard recently that things haven't changed much. They were selling their milk below production price. Why? Because they were being pitted by the supermarket who said, if you don't lower your price, we'll buy it from somewhere else. And they would say the same thing to the other producers. So they would have to survive by having another income. Maybe the wife has a full-time job, etc., etc. And that's the situation for a lot of producers. I'm sure not only in food, but of course you are more vulnerable when you produce something fresh. You just have to sell it, you know, or it goes to waste. So you know, having shorter supply chains, direct marketing means that, you know, the producer, the service provider will have a greater percentage of that income instead of that being eaten up by middlemen. That, you know, when we say middlemen, it's usually shareholding companies that are producing, you know, wealth for distant shareholders, which of course might be individuals or pension funds. You know, it's not necessarily, but it is a system that can't bring about an equitable economy. It can't bring about a sustainable economy. No, it can't bring about well-being. So we do have to make changes.
So that, sorry.
No,
I
talk
was
too
just,
much.
no, it's fine. I was just trying to squeeze in one last question, if I could, for you. There's a question in the chat again saying that how lasting is the change for strengthening democracies at the local government level? For instance, when locally elected officials change or priorities of national governments move on in a different direction, does the change implemented at local government level last?
It's a very, very good point, Natasha, because often it doesn't. Because the way in most countries things are screwed together is that the national legislation has precedence over local legislation. Not always. I mean, there are a lot of variation, and even international legislation, or like the treaties, take precedence over our own national legislation. I think that's where something like the Future Generations Act in Wales is a good example. Not yet, you know, that it's fully effective, but having something like that in place, that means that you have to consider when you make new legislation what, you know, the well-being, be it of this present, or, you know, it should be well-being, of course, of both environment and people. But I was mentioning before the ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlements that are written into most free trade treaties. And quite often, you know, one government will make a deal with a company. Sometimes it's corrupt, you know, governments that will make a deal that's really bad for a country or for a community or for the environment, and they make it anyway. They give them a concession to mine, say. And then a new government is elected, and they might say, we don't want to frack. We don't want to, you know, to overfish. We don't want, and then they get sued, bang, in these corporate courts, and because they don't want to just go on with, they want to protect their people, protect their environment, no? And so, and that's on a national level, no? But the same thing can also happen on a local. So it doesn't mean that when we have a win, that win is secured. And I'd say, while it is very, very important that we do what we can on a local level, we do have to think, even though it's very difficult to see right now how we can change something like the trade treaties. But what we can't do is that we can't shut our eyes and say, just because we don't know how we're going to stop this juggernaut now, we shouldn't talk about it. We have to talk it, because that's how you build a mass movement that can bring about a tipping point, no?
Yeah. So, yes, I think you're right, that we need to keep persisting and keep building these communities, as you say. But I'm afraid we've come to the end of our allotted time. It leaves me to thank Anja very much for her really interesting talk. Thank you for the questions that you put into the chat. I'm sorry if I didn't get a chance to ask all of them. But thank you for joining us. And yeah, if we have one more One Planet Week event tomorrow, you're welcome to join us at that. But other than that, I hope to see you at future events. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jo. It was a pleasure. Thank you to everybody in the chat box. I wish I could see you. I'm sure everybody has some really interesting stuff to share too.
Thank you, Anja.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good luck tomorrow.
Thank you.